Get us started. My name is Dakota Wagner. I'm the Southeast Region Coordinator with the Forest Stewards Guild. And the Forest Stewards Guild is a national forestry nonprofit. Our headquarters are in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I'm located in Asheville, North Carolina. And today we have a panel focused on forest management with salamanders in mind, and we have 4 great panelists. And I will hand it off to themselves to introduce themselves, but we've got Apodaca, John Maerz, Lori Williams, and Kristen Cecala. So thanks all for joining us today. And if you can see in the chat box for those who are just joining us, introducing yourselves, name, affiliation, and location. I've seen we've got a good number of folks from North Carolina and Southeast, but we've got a good number of folks from New England and the Northeast as well. So thanks for joining us. All right, so what I'll do is I'll stop sharing my screen and then we can get our panelists to introduce yourselves and we'll get that question. And so when y'all are introducing yourselves, if you could just please describe the work that you do and your favorite salamander. We're starting with JJ.
Hey everybody, I'm Apodaca. I'm with Tangled Bank Conservation, and I'm also the executive director for the Amphibian and Reptile Conservancy. I spend a lot of time, obviously, on salamander conservation and all amphibian and reptile conservation work kind of across the country, doing a lot of restoration work and a lot of conservation genetic work specifically. My favorite salamander, that's a really tough one, but I guess I have to stick with my original favorite of the Red Hill salamander from Alabama.
Thanks, JJ. All right, Kristen, over to you.
Hey everyone, I'm Kristen Cecala. I am a part-time administrator, part-time faculty member this year at the University of the South. My research is largely in understanding mechanisms for how salamanders, but also other amphibians respond to kind of broader scale changes in their environment. So all of my work is done with undergraduates, and my administrative work is partially in working with our campus manager. We have about 13,000 acres of forest that we try to manage in a sustainable fashion. I've also done work across the Southeast, so I've got experience in the coastal plain, Piedmont mountains, and now here in sort of more the xeric Cumberland Plateau. So happy to kind of talk about some of those comparisons. My favorite salamander, I was kind of split between the red salamander, just because they're fun to find, and then also black bellies, because they've got a lot of personality.
Thanks, Kristen. I think one of my questions later during our question and answers is going to be, how does a salamander have personality? All right, John, over to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm John Maerz. I'm a professor in the Warnell School of Forestry and Natural Resources at the University of Georgia. I have been working on salamander ecology and all aspects of it for 30 years now. And I study a range of things, working on the importance of salamanders in ecosystems, things that drive their population dynamics and abundance in different places in relation to everything from invasive species to climate change and land use. Like Kristen, I've worked a lot in the mountains, in the Appalachian Mountains. I've worked in the Northeast, in New York and Pennsylvania, on these animals, and then I do some work in the coastal plain on a couple salamander species as well. Kind of depending on where I am, I love all the salamanders in the genus Puthodon, so that's what I got started with, and I think my favorite among them right now is the red-legged salamanders that I work on in Western North Carolina. But I also have developed a really strong affection for striped newts, which is this just little newt that is barely hanging on in Florida and Georgia. And so we're trying to give it a lot of love and attention right now.
Great. Thanks, John. Lori, over to you.
Hey everyone. I'm Lori Williams, a conservation biologist for the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission and our Wildlife Diversity Program. And I'm in the western part of the state in our Appalachian mountain region. And my work, the the bulk of my work is to coordinate and conduct our amphibian projects for the state here in the mountain region. And that includes a lot of kind of distributional inventory surveys, monitoring surveys, technical guidance, and partnering with collaborators for research, that sort of thing. And I'm choosing two favorites. I've got an aquatic salamander, hellbender, which I put on my background screen. And my terrestrial favorite is the green salamander. And both are just awesome animals with awesome life histories, super interesting, super fun to work with, and definitely in need of conservation attention.
All right, great. Thanks all. So we are going to jump into the first question. And the first question is, from your experience, what does forest management with salamanders in mind look like? And we're going to be talking about habitats, give some background information about salamanders, and looking at different habitat conditions. And I believe, Lori, we had you first to be answering this one.
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. Pretty complex one. But I like to approach a question like this, and when we have a situation where we can, work with partners and maybe come up with strategies to mitigate impacts on salamander. Just to start with, think like a salamander. What is it that the animal needs for its full life cycle? Maybe habitat specialists are present in your forest unit that's going to be managed. A good example of that is what I just mentioned, the green salamander. It's a habitat specialist that needs rock outcrops that are shaded, kept humid. They use shrub cover around the rocks as well. So just very specialized conditions. So, just kind of knowing your salamander community is a start in an area that's going to be managed. And then, kind of early on in the process, just what do these animals need? What can we do to kind of mitigate impacts on them? And in the case of the green salamander, it may be to buffer those rock outcrop habitats from timbering. So leave some mature forest around them, for example. And, it's very similar with other sensitive areas like wetlands and streams. They may need to be buffered and just keep water quality in mind, keep salamanders that need upland habitat as well as wetland habitat. They're traversing between the two, often long distances, things, keeping that in mind. Even can a forestry objective be achieved with a less aggressive timber method? I think that's a valid question. If you can get by with a less heavy-handed approach at timber removal, maybe that's the way to go. One that retains more basal area, more coarse woody debris, less soil compaction, that sort of thing. But yeah, overall, think like a salamander.
I think I was tasked with talking a little bit about streams. So stream salamanders, they've got a really wide diversity of life histories within streams. So you have some that are direct developers, meaning that they don't even have a larval stage. And then you have others that spend lots of different years, many years, maybe 3 or 4 years as larvae in streams. So you can almost think of them as tiny little fish sort of things that are able to use the terrestrial landscape around them. And when they transform into adults, they'll spend time both in and around the stream, but actually a lot of them spend considerable amounts of time up in the uplands away from those streams. So protecting salamanders and thinking about management with stream salamanders in mind, it's really thinking about stream buffers, not just as buffers for water quality or for the conditions within the stream, but also maintaining primary habitat for those adults. So I think management kind of with stream salamanders in mind is just kind of thinking about minimizing impacts, minimizing the changes to sedimentation and erosion, changes to temperature, and then even things like leaf litter quality could affect sort of what's happening within the stream. So I think, maybe thinking a little bit more nuanced than just stream management zones about, are there areas that are maybe steeper, they're going to have more direct connections to the stream where changes in that particular area may have greater impacts than in other places. So otherwise, I think it's just sort of a very standard kind of protect the stream, protect the habitat around it, and consider how to minimize how what's happening further away from it is connected to it.
I can't remember if I was going to ask about the coastal plain. Was that?
Yes,
Sandy
yeah,
soils,
and
yeah.
sandy soils and
Yeah.
I mean, really, whatever discussion y'all want to have that adds to each other.
Did you want to address that first, JJ?
No, you can go ahead.
All right. So a couple of things that are, and sometimes are counterintuitive for forest management in like the coastal plain and pine savanna areas and stuff, relates really to a couple important things. One is managing basal area to not be too dense, so leaving more open canopy systems there, because that affects the hydrology of the wetlands. So when we have high density, for example, high density pine biomass in the uplands around wetlands in the coastal plain, it tends to shorten those hydro periods and make those systems less able to support a lot of the important salamander species we see in there, such as flatwood salamanders or striped newts. These guys, need a kind of a certain hydro period. So keeping those systems from becoming overly dense is really important. It's also important to have fire in those systems, both that help manage the upland, but also do get in occasionally into the wetlands and keep the canopies open in the wetlands. The other thing that's really important then is protection of the soils around these wetlands. So nearly all of the species of salamanders that occupy these wetlands will use burrow systems in the uplands immediately surrounding, so within a couple hundred meters of those water bodies. And a lot of the activities that often go up there, so with regards to forest practices, things like bedding or agricultural practices like disking of soils, or just using machinery that really does a number on the soils, essentially kind of ruins those burrow systems and reduces the amount of habitat that these animals have when they migrate out of the wetlands during dry down. So thinking upland upland management in the coastal plain and how we manage those forests is really, really important. The type locations for some of our species have been lost in the coastal plain, so those species can no longer be found, and it's very directly attributable to disruption of the soil and the surrounding forest structure around those wetlands. We're pretty obviously to blame for the loss of those species at those locations.
Yeah, I think I was going to talk about sort of the larger river systems and salamanders in those, and for most of us that means hellbenders and water dogs. And I think like sort of everything everybody has said on here so far sort of applies to this, because for these species, sort of larger watershed health is really the most important thing. And so there's some direct impacts when you're thinking about these things, like a lot of the things that Kristen mentioned in terms of buffering the streams and hopefully leaving some of that shade canopy on both sides of the streams or rivers is really important for these guys. But also, again, like that larger watershed picture is really important. So that can mean that you can lose populations, we can lose populations, even if you buffer, an immediate habitat, but upstream the buffer is really thin, and a lot of those soils are running off into the larger river system or small streams, right? Like, a lot of people tend to forget that those streams, the small streams, when they get sedimented in, are carrying that sediment into the larger river systems over time. And that can be really detrimental to these species, mostly like filling in all those little interstitial spaces that the larvae and the juveniles need, and also their prey base needs, just like trout or anything else in those water systems. And then the last major thing there, I think that's really important to remember is those again, you can buffer a stream as big as you want, but a lot of those benefits go away if your stream crossings are uncontrolled, and you're just dumping sediment into the stream crossings from those areas. So having proper stream crossings, you know, makes a big difference in the larger watershed.
Dakota, I had two questions for you. One, there was a question that was put in the chat for Lori, I think about light timber harvest. And then the other question is, did you want me to talk about soil, like invasive species at this point in terms of forest management, or later?
We were going to touch on that a little bit later. But yeah, that question from Tom, it says, what specifically is it about a light timber harvest approach that will benefit them? Is it the shade retention, coarse woody debris, leaf litter production? Which attribute?
Yeah, you nailed it. All of that. If you can meet your goal of, let's say, a certain basal area retention, or just to create some canopy gaps, you know, versus what I would consider a more heavy-handed approach of, so like an all-out clear cut. If you can meet your objective, retain you know, more basal area, more shade, more, you know, areas of hospitable conditions, that would certainly, you know, should lessen impact overall of the salamander community in that unit. But exactly what you said, you know, the shade, of course, woody debris, that's important to leave that as residual material if you can, and if that meshes with your goals for that unit. Of course, leaf litter is important for them. We've mentioned soil compaction. So yeah, all of those things could help, you know, mitigate. There's still going to be impact. I think that's something we're all aware of, that, you know, we're not talking about wilderness areas where nothing goes on, or preserves where nothing goes on. So any change in the forest has the potential to impact these guys, either direct mortality from the action itself, or kind of a lagged effect of year 2 and year 3 after a cut, where you know, things kind of get progressively worse. But yeah, you're on the right track, I think, with those kind of attributes that could be important. Anybody else on the panel have anything else to say about that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think you nailed it.
Right. Great. Thanks all. And we did have another question from Scott, and I think I like how y'all are typing in your questions to the chat box now, and I think it is appropriate with this panel setup. If you have a question during a certain time, just feel free to type it in whenever. And if we have time during the specific sections we're in, we can definitely ask it. So from Scott, he asked, how important is pond water temperature?
So it is important, particularly depending on where you are, because as you warm up pond water, you reduce dissolved oxygen. So depending on what species you have in those systems, it can be an issue. That said, a lot of these species are adapted to you know, like a fairly wide range of temperatures within those natural systems. So, you know, some of the spotted salamanders and other ambystomatids, they can gulp air. The newts can gulp air. And so they have behaviors for when temperatures get too high, or at least dissolved oxygen levels get low, that they can compensate for that somewhat. And down in the coastal plain and parts of Georgia, you know, those wetlands can get very warm. They're shallow, and these guys do just fine in them. So, you know, as long as it's pretty uncommon for temperatures to get beyond what the animals can physiologically tolerate. If you get warm temperatures that they can survive, but dissolved oxygen gets down, it does things like slow their growth rates down. Sometimes they come out of the water a little bit smaller than you would find otherwise. And so, you know, that can reduce their survival later. But I don't think in most of these cases, the shading of the wetlands or something like that, or the ponds for temperature purposes, is that critical. It's more that some species really like vernal pools and these kind of things, because they just provide certain kinds of resources and structure, and certain kinds of aquatic communities within them. So, but in a lot of these systems, we find that, you know, a more open canopy above the water tends to favor the animals. The systems are just more there's more food, there's more production in the system, and so it's generally better to have the system a little bit open when it comes to the water. Now the streams are a different story, and Kristen may want to. I think you get a different answer when you ask about stream temperatures and stream inputs compared to the ponds.
Yeah, I was just going to clarify that not all amphibians behave that way, that, streams and rivers that have relatively high dissolved oxygen because they're moving, things like temperature really impact their performance. So we've seen that like salamanders get more aggressive towards each other, and they often sort of slow their growth rates down when they get sort of at those maximum temperatures, which we're already seeing in some areas of the Southern Appalachians.
All right, thanks all. And we have a question from AJ. How much space does your typical individual salamander need to complete its life cycle? And then he gives examples: 10 square feet, an acre, 10 acres, more or less.
I guess I can take that. I guess, I mean, there's so many different answers to this question based on the different species here. Like some of our plethodonid species, might need less than a meter or smaller than that they might never leave that meter square plot in their life. And others, might need, particularly like some of the ambistomid salamanders that are pond dwellers and then migrate out, might need pretty large, over an acre or so. And so that's like, it really depends on like what type of habitat you're in and what species there are and those things. But I'll also say that, these salamanders, especially in the Southern Appalachians and some other parts of the country, make up more biomass than the rest of the vertebrates combined, right? And so it's not, we shouldn't be thinking about them as like a single individuals. We should be thinking about them as a large, spread out population across the landscape. And what are you doing to that landscape? And how does taking a couple acres of really good habitat affect the larger population there? Because we tend to think of this as like, well, if we affect a certain small area that things can just move back in, and that doesn't always happen with salamanders. They're not really evolved to like migrate the way that a mammal or a bird or even a turtle would. Their kind of defense mechanism against some of these changes is to go down in the ground and then eventually die because the habitat's gone or the soil is compacted or something like that. So yeah, really complex there, and varies across a bunch of species. I don't know if anybody else wants to add to that.
I think the only thing I would add is that, sort of like JJ was saying about population sizes and things like that, it's not necessarily like a forest isn't a forest. If you have a small patch, but you don't have sort of the interior of it, a salamander isn't going to perceive that as an intact forest. So size kind of does matter in terms of forest size.
I guess I would also add, and Kristen can probably reinforce this, that when you increase an area, you increase the potential for complexity. And what happens is that when you get very small patches or very simplified environments, then a few species win and they tend to kick out some. So there's a few species that can be very small and abundant and productive, and they just kind of outcompete everything else, or they're just kind of the big bad boys, the bullies in the community. So Kristen's favorite salamander there, the black belly, is a stream bully. And so other species, in order to be able to kind of co-occupy those streams, they need their own little places in the world. So they need kind of areas that they can exist in that black bellies don't use or can't use. And so when you get simplified streams or you get simplified other kinds of habitats, you tend to get less diversity of salamander species in those systems.
All right, thanks all. And we have had a few other questions come into the chat box, which I have saved to ask when we have more time for questions, but it is time to move on to our next kind of pre-written question, which is, what changes have you seen in the way forest management is approached in considering the intersection of forestry and wildlife management?
Yeah, I think I'll start on that one. Simply increased awareness for sure. I mean, I'm in my 20th year in my current job with the state agency, and I've seen definitely over that time just more awareness, more conversation, more thinking of these species that may not benefit from a certain forestry action, but the forestry action is needed overall for the landscape, yada yada. But what we're very fortunate here in Western North Carolina, especially, to have just a great group of partners, of state foresters, federal foresters, private foresters, our wildlife colleagues, just working in partnership very early on in project design, project review. That's key, is have these conversations very early. Not when the timber sale is already written up and being sold. We're talking sometimes years in advance of having these conversations. So that's probably a change from what has happened in the past. Also, the state agencies have these wildlife plans called wildlife action plans, or state conservation plans, that identify salamanders that are species of greatest conservation need, or identify state listed species or other priority species. So that's new in the last couple of decades. We have this kind of blueprint, this kind of list of salamanders that we are concerned with, and our forestry partners take that into consideration as well. Also different and kind of a growing trend is a very well-informed public. We have so much more public engagement now from environmental activist groups, NGOs, just interested members of the public that want salamanders and things like old growth forests to have a seat at the table alongside advocates for game species and advocates for early successional forests. So it's a much more kind of comprehensive approach to forest management, I think, which does, brings to bear even some conflict, as you can imagine, but that's all part of the process. And I think it's a good process, just overall awareness increasing and trying to keep these animals in mind. Yeah, I think that's all I've got on that one.
Thanks, Lori. And then I think we had John or anyone else that wanted to kind of touch on the research perspective.
So I think, and some of these are related to some of the comments that are questions that have come up. So I think one of the things that I've seen really change is the idea of managing forests for multiple objectives, right? And that goes both ways. That I'm glad to see salamanders getting more attention in the context of both private and other kinds of forest management, but also areas where we manage for salamanders, also recognizing that there are other conservation and management needs, and that these things, we're trying to balance those. So one of the people asked about measification. So this is something that we're directly addressing right now in the Nantahala region, as Lori knows. So we're doing work with the Forest Service to look at things like what happens if we restore fire to these systems to promote oak and hickory, growth and regeneration, kind of open those canopies up. We expect that's going to have some effect on the salamanders, but we're not seeing oak recruitment in some of those areas. And so we need to understand that relationship. But oaks and things they're important species too, and they're important for a lot of wildlife. And so we have to figure out how we balance objectives at different scales. We're doing a lot of work on things like, efforts to preserve hemlock. And how does that interact with salamanders? Is that good for salamanders? Does it matter if it's good for salamanders, and those kind of things? So I think that we're looking at I think one of the things that's changed is that more holistic look at that. We need, we have multiple objectives for forests, but also we need to have different kinds of forests in different places, and that part of salamander conservation isn't just thinking about trying to do the same thing at every location, but to have a mosaic of habitats and conditions out there on the landscape that both support salamanders and support other important plant and animal species as well. So that, I think that approach has been really rewarding to be part of the last 10 years or so, and I think it's something that I find really great. And working in Western North Carolina, where a lot of that is a balance between national forests, state forest lands, but also private landowners, is really rewarding to work in that context.
All right, thank you both. We do have a lot of questions that I think tie in really great to our next section. So I might just pivot into that, which the title of the section, the question is, what are some practices a forest manager can implement to conserve salamander habitat? And John, this is where we have you kind of talking about invasive species management. And I just wanted to flag kind of right off the bat a question that came in about if any of you run into invasive amphibians, and then considering the challenges amphibians face as a whole, how do you deal with that situation when one becomes invasive or overpopulates an environment? And then if not, why don't they typically or commonly become invasive?
Yeah, so to the latter question there about invasive, we do not really have too many cases of invasive salamanders. It might be a problem some of us want. There have been examples of translocations, accidental, of salamanders around, and they have established. So for example, here in Athens, Clark County, we have an established population of black belly salamanders, which are not natural, and they do not, they shouldn't be here. They were introduced as accidental translocations in the bait trade. They're used as fishing bait quite extensively. And there have been introductions of salamanders from the southeastern part of the US into the Ozarks and those kind of things. So we have some populations. We have an population of Plethodon jordanii, the red cheek salamanders, which are very important and widely recognized animals in North Carolina that have been introduced to Mountain Lake in Virginia. But the numbers of cases of successful translocations of salamanders is probably remarkably low, and we don't see too much evidence yet. But that said, we are deeply concerned about diseases that get moved around from the commercial trade in salamanders from other parts of the world, and how diseases that have been associated with some of those things, such as the newts from Asia, which carry some fungal pathogens that could be potentially devastating to our native newts or our native other groups of native salamanders in North America. So there's a lot of concern and current vigilance in that area to try and hopefully reduce the likelihood that we introduce diseases from foreign species into North America. That said, a really good best practice is don't move them around, don't use salamanders as bait, and don't, if you find a salamander or you're interested in poking around with salamanders, keep them where you found them. So there's not really a need to move them around, and you should do that with great care. Even moving local species around relatively locally, we know that some of the diseases that these animals have, they evolve local resistance to the strains of a virus or something that is in their local environment. And you can move an animal to a new location where you introduce a different strain, and that can really impact that local salamander population because they're just not as JJ mentioned, they don't move far, they don't disperse great distances. And so you could introduce a local variant of a virus, and that could really devastate a local population of salamanders just by moving animals locally. So a really great best practice is, manage the ones that are on your turf and try and be very careful or cautious about moving animals around, either relatively locally or certainly over larger spatial scales. The other thing then is I've done a fair bit of work on soil like soil invertebrates that get moved around. And a lot of the soil invertebrates that we find around, particularly in the northeastern United States, but it's true here in southern Appalachia, they are introduced, and they are introduced historically. They were mostly European in origin and were brought over the last couple centuries as people kind of moved into the area. So you can think of earthworms as a great example of that. But more recently, we've had a lot of accidental introductions of soil fauna from Asia. And these things are mostly spread around accidentally through ornamental plants and moving soil and these kind of things, or their use in bait trade. And once these things get into systems, they are really difficult for us to control. They get moved around by road management and all of these kind of things. And a lot of them, we have detected some potentially negative effects. So earthworms have a really, we've documented that they have a really devastating effect on salamander populations in the Northeast. There are some folks in other parts of the US who found that things like introduced crayfish can affect stream and pond salamander populations. We've been doing some work here in the Southern Appalachians, looking at the movement of things like the Asian needle ant, which kicks out a lot of the ant species that are native to the region. These ants are important both for plants in Southern Appalachia, but they also displace the ants that are really the dominant thing that salamanders in Southern Appalachian feed on. So some of the salamander populations around Macon County, North Carolina, stuff like that, and other parts of Western North Carolina, about 60% of the food that they eat is ants. And these Asian needle ants come in and kind of kick out the native ant. And we're not sure yet, whether or not the salamanders really do shift their diets to these introduced ants, but they may not. So that's something, the movement of soil organisms around is something I think is something that most people are not aware. But when you go to Lowe's and you buy plants and you move them out and you plant them around your house and the shrubs, you're introducing almost invariably soil organisms that will move off into the forest and can potentially really be devastating to those ecosystems and the animals, including salamanders that reside with them. So I think soil invasions of soil fauna and those kind of things are something that we have a lot of concern over. And once it's out of the bag, it's really hard. I don't have these are one of the things where I don't have a solution for you of how to put the toothpaste back in the tube there, like once it's out. So the really important thing is preventative measures about being really vigilant about moving things around that can introduce foreign species to forests where they could really have an impact. Somebody asked in there, how do you reduce so don't move soil as much as you can, buy local, work with local nurseries if you're buying plants and stuff like that. But also when you bring things home, if you're going to plant them, wash the root system, like take the soil that they come in off and wash that. Try not to buy or use mulch and those kind of things from around the area, and be really careful about what you do near roadside. So up in the mountains, for example, the management of road edges, those machinery move soil, that machinery moves soil around a lot. If you're doing forest management, make sure that you clean vehicles and equipment as you move around from location to location. JJ can probably tell you that PARC, Partners in Amphibian Reptile Conservation, I think has some guidelines about the management of equipment used to reduce the likelihood of spreading diseases and foreign organisms around to reduce the impact of invasive species. And there's a person asked about earthworms. So what earthworms do is earthworms are nature's plow, right? So they like to chew up leaf litter. So if you are a farmer or something, you might think that's a great thing to have worms working your gardens and your fields and stuff. But in a forest, that leaf litter is the fundamental structural it provides both the energy that fuels a lot of the food web, but it keeps the soil moist, it buffers temperatures, it creates a matrix of things where there's insects and little salamanders, particularly juveniles, can run around in there and feed and grow. And what earthworms do is they turn that over. So some of our work in the Northeast shows that leaf litter that should last on the forest floor for 3 or 4 or 5 years will be turned over in 6 months when you get introduced earthworms into those systems. And so the forest spends a large portion of the year with not much, if any, leaf litter cover. There's no big accumulation of humus in those systems. And our work has shown that earthworms can reduce the amount of energy that then flows to things like salamander populations through the leaf litter by about 75 to 80%. So you just reduce the fertility of the system. And then as Lori talked about, the kind of climate, the microclimates that these animals need. So earthworms have a really dramatic negative effect on salamander ecology, particularly where we've studied it in the Northeast. We haven't had too much opportunity to study it in the South, but in the Northeast, it really can pummel habitats for salamanders quite dramatically.
Yeah, good stuff, John. I think I was going to talk about sort of genetics and climate adaptive management. And that's something that I hear a lot of like, well, not necessarily what does it matter, but fears that we're going to do this management and then climate change is going to sort of ruin it all, or a disease is going to ruin it all. And so I like to think a lot about like, how do we like proof these populations against that? How do we like buffer them and make it so that they can withstand these changes? And like, obviously we don't have all the answers to that. But in the end, in my mind, that comes down to resilient populations and lots of genetic diversity. And you get that genetic diversity from large populations. So the more we can manage these populations and keep them as large populations and not as small patches, the more genetic diversity they have. And that genetic diversity is literally the currency that these species need to be able to adapt to, whatever that threat is, whether it is climate change or disease, or in some cases, invasive species. And so that's a really important component to all this. And I spend a lot of time thinking about the effects of losing that genetic diversity and how they get lost. And which I guess kind of makes me a nerd, but really what happens, because we've been talking about this, that a lot of these salamanders aren't moving a whole bunch, which means that even if we're not careful in how we dissect up the forest in terms of management and roads and how we make up mosaic patches and those sorts of things, what happens is we start to get islands of habitat, and we think, oh, we've left X number of acres of salamander habitat, but you've just essentially created these islands. And what happens in an island situation is that you have naturally small populations which are more susceptible to kind of random events and loss that way, but they also start inbreeding, and inbreeding is sort of obviously like we think poorly of inbreeding in people, and for good reason, right? It's like it has a really negative effect on populations as well. And what happens is, as individuals are inbreeding, you're losing genetic diversity, but you're not just losing that genetic diversity in these small populations. The loss of that genetic diversity and through inbreeding and homozygosity actually lowers their ability to reproduce as successfully. So, in some cases, we're talking about, something as low as 10, 20, 30% of a reduction in fecundity of reproductive capacity. But over time, and again, already a small population, those numbers have a really huge effect. And so you start to see this downward spiral that we call the extinction vortex, where you've got small populations, and so they inbreed, they've got less genetic diversity, they're more susceptible, and they reproduce less. And so they're, again, a smaller population. And of course, that spiral just keeps going. And so if you can think about sort of the larger landscape and managing that larger landscape for connectivity and larger populations as a whole, rather than small individual islands, For salamanders, you're much better off. And again, a lot of that can come back to sort of things that we've been talking about, Lori, in the beginning of having a softer footprint, so some of that is leaving habitat, and others is having a softer footprint in important areas of connectivity. And it's really, from a forestry standpoint, not all that much more work or more difficult. It's just the act of like thinking it out and planning and being a little more proactive about it. Yeah. So anybody else want to jump in on that one? There was one other question that I wanted to address about the pet trade. Somebody asked about on that note, how does the pet trade affect salamander conservation? I think that's a really great question, and one we're more and more worried about. John mentioned disease and spreading that disease through the pet trade, which is definitely true. The other thing is just that we're seeing a lot more activity in the pet trade of collecting some of these salamanders. And so again, when you have these populations that are small and people come in and take 100 salamanders, that can have a huge impact on the genetics and the abundance of these populations that can really drive it down. And for some species, like green salamanders, some of the more rare things, that those collections can be absolutely detrimental. We're seeing that more and more in salamanders, and of course right now it's really affecting turtles.
I just wanted to follow up one thing and sort of in response, I think, to one of the questions. So JJ mentioned about sort of maintaining large populations and things like that. And I think for stream habitats, it's very easy to think of a stream as a continuous habitat. But every time that stream gets crossed, you have the potential for isolation of stream populations, either upstream or downstream of those roads, power lines, whatever it is. So if you're sort of interested in managing streams on your own property for catching salamanders and things like that, I think that was in one of the comments. I mean, I think making sure that you're retaining that riparian buffer and trying to minimize the width and changes of those kinds of gaps over streams can be really important, because otherwise streams kind of appear linear, even though the populations may not be.
Yeah, I'll jump in on this topic with some thoughts. So what a practice as a forest manager can do to conserve habitat. We've mentioned a lot of them, about things like coarse woody debris and prioritizing specialized habitats with buffers and so forth. And JJ was getting at also the point of keeping in mind forested corridors, so like connectivity between, say, source populations and areas that may get depleted of animals, and how could those animals get recolonized in the future. Keeping in mind areas of refugia. So again, some of the kind of these mosaic effect, or this kind of just diversity in a forest unit would help. Reducing fragmentation, that's kind of the thing that we're talking about. Also, I don't think we've mentioned yet, but with forest management, consider the seasonality of your forest actions. So if you've got the chance to do a timber harvest when salamanders are kind of down and dormant, versus very surface active, nesting near the surface, all those things, that could have a huge impact too, just the timing of these actions, the timing and the seasonality of timber harvest, or even things like prescribed fire. So I don't think that was mentioned yet, but that's something to keep in mind. And, from an agency perspective, what I see, and probably anybody else out there in the audience who works for a state or federal agency probably is in the same boat, we lack the resources and people to really do some of these basic population data assessments for these salamander species that may be impacted, that are needed. Even at the more basic level, distributional surveys. So what does the community look like that may be impacted? Where are the source populations around it? What species make that up? Do we have baseline data ahead of a forestry action, say ahead of a timber cut? Even better, can we monitor after that cut long term? These are long-lived species. Population structure, it may take a while to see changes in that because they are long-lived and some are slow to mature. So from an agency perspective, it's kind of frustrating that we don't have a lot of those resources to kind of tackle those basic questions. And that's where we do rely on our university partners a lot to kind of get at that. But even that, some of the studies may be shorter than they need to be. There are studies in literature and more coming online where folks are looking at this, 10, 20-year studies to see when salamanders may come back into an area that's been timbered, for instance. But just some of those questions are what we really need. Just basic population trends, population status before and after.
All right. Do y'all have any general thoughts about forest management before we jump into some of these questions? Cool. So we have been getting a few questions in registration and in the chat box today about fire and forest management and salamander populations. A couple questions about prescribed fire, and then there was actually a question about wildfire and like the re-entry of salamanders after a wildfire, or how to I can't think of the word right now, but how to encourage like salamanders to come back to an area after a fire.
So I can take on a little bit of that because that's an active line of research. So starting in 2008, well, before that, we started some work with the National Park Service in Western North Carolina and Eastern Tennessee back around 2015. We did a several-year study looking at stream salamanders, like Kristen tends to work on in Great Smoky Mountains National Park, and how they were responding to both prescribed fire, but also fires that were started either by lightning or by people, but the Park Service let them burn. And what we found is that there were some short-term changes in the salamander communities, but then they were within 2 or 3 years post-burn, the communities looked the way they did prior to the burn. And so one of our recommendations from that was that as long as the burn interval is not too fast, you probably will just see kind of the community kind of ebbing back and forth between being dominated by one species and then dominated by another. And there were, of course, we also had in 2016, we had the really significant fires up in Western North Carolina, the fires near Gatlinburg that were really destructive, and the large fire there down towards the southern part of Western North Carolina. And we don't have great data on some of the more intense areas. So I don't know if Lori knows more, but some of those streams and forests were hit pretty hard. But some work that Bill Peterman at Ohio State and his students have done have shown that the salamanders did not go extinct in those really intense fire areas. They did persist, and their numbers look okay. They are rebounding okay. It looks like the juveniles, particularly the really small ones, kind of took a hit, but they have rebounded since. So those kind of catastrophic wildfires, I don't think we're expecting them to be as frequent at such that it's going to be a chronic problem. I mean, it may get more frequent than it has been in the past, depending on what happens with kind of human activities and climate change in that area. But that was an epic drought that created a set of conditions that allowed a human sort of fires to kind of really push on the landscape. What we've been studying in Macon County is the restoration of prescribed fire by the Forest Service. This is an effort to reduce the overgrowth of rhododendron and increase oak and hickory recruitment in those watersheds. And what we have been seeing so far is some small-ish, maybe if you squint really hard, reductions in salamander abundance, but we do see changes in their behavior. and their population structure in those areas. But even after 3 burns over a 4-year cycle, the salamanders are doing just fine. I mean, there are some aspects of their biology we think are changing, but I don't think that we're going to see changes that indicate that they're going to go extinct or that they're going to need to recolonize. So I think that that's encouraging. Generally, my experience with those fires is that either the Forest Service is burning during the winter, so like in February. So as Lori was talking about, we're not burning at a time when the salamanders are likely to be surface active. These are also extremely low intensity fires, right? So they don't even burn off all the litter in a watershed typically. So in those wet systems, when you're using prescribed fire, I don't think that there's much risk of direct mortality to many of the salamanders. I think that, Kristen can probably back me up here, but I think that if conditions are dry enough for you to get a good burn in a watershed, those salamanders are probably predominantly underground when that burn rolls through. And then they just come back up and they resume their activity. So I do not see much evidence other than small effects that the restoration of low intensity prescribed fire or periodic natural fires that burn without too much intensity will really have a big effect on these animals.
I would support all of that. And the only thing I would say is sort of maybe a little bit further west here towards the plateau and even into Arkansas, fire has repeatedly been shown to actually have positive effects on terrestrial salamanders. And I think some of that's been associated with increased like shrub and herb growth on the forest floor. So burning can open up some of those habitats and create some additional productivity on the forest floor.
And salamanders like to climb. So they do they do use ground structure for to regulate their thermal biology and their dehydration. They like to get off the ground sometimes under certain conditions. And so having a shrub layer or an herbaceous layer that they can climb can be an important part of their biology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with everything that's been said, and you see in the literature, a growing number of research studies, and you dig deep, and you may kind of see a mixed bag of results, some benefits, some more negative impacts, and it depends largely on the system and the animals you're talking about, the generalists versus specialists, and the kind of fires and locations. But certainly fire is a major push with our public forest management these days, because largely it's been fire suppressed for decades. So getting fire back on the landscape to manage for fire adapted forest types and veg types, or even fire dependent communities as well. Also, reduce those fuels so that we don't have these catastrophic wildfires that nobody wants. We have seen those 2016 fires, at least with one of our green salamander species, hickory nut gorge green salamander, was subject to a major fire that same year, 2016, and took a big hit. And again, that's a specialist, habitat specialist. But when its rock outcrops get completely daylighted, hotter, drier, subject to wind, that's a species that really suffered. And that species, we've also, another example, we've completed about a 10-year study looking at the Blue Ridge population of green salamander with prescribed fire. Pretty short return intervals, 3 to 4 year return intervals and multiple fires, and the salamander populations have not responded well. And we're digging into that more, but canopy cover was significantly reduced. The shrub cover was knocked back, which was an objective of the foresters. I wanted to knock back some of that really thick rhododendron and laurel cover, which green salamanders do use and do climb on. So it can be kind of a mixed bag, and it really depends on the species you're talking about and the kind of habitats you're talking about. But
and I think Lori's point is the
Mm-hmm.
critical one. I think your point is the critical one there, right? Like there are special places and particular habitats that need to be protected against these things.
Mhm.
But then there's other areas where we can manage for oak recruitment or all those things where we're not going to impact some of those specific sensitive species, and those other objectives are important as well.
And what's cool about this long-term fire study that we've done, and again, with just wonderful partners with our state forestry folks, North Carolina Forest Service, we come back to the table and we see these results of this data collection and say, okay, what can we do different? What are some other strategies we can do going forward? Because getting fire back on the landscape is still a major objective. They're still going to be burning, pretty short intervals until they get a handle on it, then kind of back off and do more maintenance burns, maybe with a longer return interval. But in the meantime, we can try to do some things, and we are experimenting with this, like different alternate firing techniques, maybe blowing debris and leaf litter away from these rock outcrops so fire doesn't run right up on them. Just making the foresters on the ground aware of where these specialized habitats are, flagging them off, really just kind of setting fire in a different strategy. So, we're doing all these things in conjunction with our forestry partners, and it's great, and we're all learning from this, and we'll continue to learn.
All right, thanks all. Moving on to a couple other questions that we got in registration. And I think, Kristen, this was one for you in particular, talking about movement. It was how and when do salamanders re-enter cutover areas, if they do?
Yeah, so I think there's been a little bit of work on sort of the shorter timescales, like Lori said, we've done a lot of work on those short timescales, and the longer timescales are still kind of projections. So I mean, salamanders behaviorally just avoid areas that are really bright, things that are hot, things that are dry. So those tend to, describe most of these kinds of cutover areas. So they're going to avoid moving into them if they can, although some of the wetland breeding species will just kind of book it across those areas, but it does put them at an increased risk of either desiccation, predation risk, and things like that. So they're doing it, but they're not being very successful, and they're not settling and using that kind of habitat. It seems to take several years for salamanders to start positively responding in those areas. So, and some of the larger species or larger individuals are going to be the ones that do that first, and then sort of followed by, their offspring. But in some population projections, it may take up to 100 years before the populations within those forests look like what they did before. So these are long-term kinds of impacts, and that's true actually for at least for some of the stream work as well, that it may not take quite as long for streams to get back. They weren't maybe as directly impacted, but it still may take, on the order of decades to return to previous conditions.
Thanks, Kristen. There was another question, and a couple questions actually, and something that we haven't touched on yet is the use of different chemicals and herbicides. And there was one question specifically about which ones to use, and then there was one which ones to not use or to try and avoid.
I can take a first stab at that. I saw the question on the frogs changing sex, so that hasn't been as documented in salamanders because most of those frogs were in habitats where they're next to agricultural fields. They can do a lot better in sort of ditches and agricultural areas, and so get exposed a lot more to those chemicals. Especially in that case, it was Roundup. However, I will say that I think salamanders are probably much more, at least plethodonid salamanders and some of the other ones are much more probably susceptible to the use of those types of chemicals, because they have permeable skin, and you know, it's just going right through their skin, whereas that happens with frogs. Their skin is a little less permeable, and so you know, it's just not a system that's been as studied. In general, I would say that you know, without a doubt, the more you can avoid pesticides and herbicides, the better. None of them are going to be good for salamanders or amphibians in general. And if you do have to use them, and if you can avoid broadcasting, that's you know, that's the really tough one. And then if you are going to broadcast, at least try to stay away from streams or any of that as much as possible. I think those are sort of the progression of towards worse there that you can. In some cases, you know, when we're restoring wetlands and things like that in the coastal plain or even in the mountains, we do have to use herbicides because of invasive species or aggressive woody growth or anything but in those cases we specifically use you know, spot application right on the tree or shrub or anything like that. So yeah, I don't know if anybody else wants to add on to that, but I would just say the more you can avoid it, the better. It's they're not gonna do well with any of those types of things.
I would just add that I have not seen, while we don't necessarily have, as JJ pointed out, the literature that you see on frogs with things like sex reversal and all that, I've not seen any herbicide that doesn't, at least in some laboratory studies, have some effect on salamanders, whether it affects their behavior, it affects their growth rate, it affects their survival. So there's no indication, there's no reason to believe that they have some resilience that we don't see in other aquatic organisms, including frogs, just because they haven't been a target of much of that research. With regards to insecticides, I think there is a little bit of work that suggests that things like neonicotinoids can be a little bit safer they're generally preferred because they're safer for vertebrates, and some of the work that's been done suggests that their use in low dosages for things like targeted protection of hemlock or other species can, you know, is fairly, it appears to be relatively benign, that the salamanders are resilient to both any potential direct effects, but also whatever kind of effects it might be having on the invertebrates in that system. It doesn't seem to be knocking them in any bad way. But there is some laboratory work that shows that neonicotinoids and other insecticides at high concentrations can have negative effects on their behavior and their survival. Those concentrations do happen sometimes, particularly in, as JJ mentioned, in wetlands, where it isn't an intentional application, but the drift or the application of it results in it getting concentrated at high levels in some of these areas. So again, you know, limiting their use, but also knowing that if you're particularly around water, or that a lot of these things get carried in water and concentrated. So if you're treating a forest, it's going to work its way to the stream. Being mindful of that, I think, is really important, in trying to limit the capacity for these things to work their way into aquatic systems is a best practice.
All right, thanks all. Next question that we have, we had a few questions. I'm trying to group them into specific categories. And one of them was specifically for private forest landowners. We had someone ask how to encourage salamander population on land that they own. And then there was another question previously that asked, how can individual forest landowners be incentivized to manage in a way that promotes amphibians? So do you have any recommendations for the private forest landowner that they can implement on their forest land?
I could take a stab at the incentives. at least here in North Carolina, an example of that. We have a voluntary program that we invite landowners to take advantage of, our wildlife conservation lands program, where a landowner can get a tax break. It's a voluntary arrangement for up to 10 years. They can get out of it at any time. It's just really no encumbrance on the landowner. But the incentive would be a tax break. Let's say you've got one of these listed salamanders on the property, or you don't even have to have a positive ID that you have it. If you have, it's one of its priority habitats on your property, that qualifies. And so we work with that landowner to kind of identify that area, even a buffer of that area to get as much acreage in as we can, and other conditions, of course, apply to determine whether a property is going to qualify or not. But in a lot of cases with salamanders, the landowner does nothing. We say, do nothing, keep the forest as it is, let it grow, keep it mature, keep the old growth, do nothing, hands off, and get a tax break for doing that. So we have that program in North Carolina. It's very successful. I'm not sure about other states, but that is one example where you could have an incentive to do something or nothing really for the salamanders and their habitats on your property.
I just had a quick addition for streams. I've seen a lot of really silly and crazy things that people think are going to help the streams, like removing all of the woody debris from them because they think that that clears it up. Again, just sort of leaving things alone and letting those processes take place is really important. Not dumping like grass clippings and things like that. That's another, or trash is another sort of thing that we see a lot of.
Yeah, somebody sort of beat me to this in the chat, but NRCS, USDA's NRCS, National Resource Conservation Service, is a great resource and agency for private landowners that might be looking for incentives to manage their land. There's we help, Amphibian and Reptile Conservancy helps manage a working lands for wildlife program for hellbenders, and so that helps kind of cover the costs of buffering rivers and helping keep sediment out of streams and paying for other practices and that sort of stuff. They also have a number of other programs that all sound like alphabet soup. Most of them just people don't even know what they stand like EQIP. I guess that's environmental quality and incentives program, something like that. But if you reach out to NRCS, they'll gladly come out and take a look and help find incentives to keep good habitat, and or in a lot of cases, especially wetlands, wetland reserve easements and those sorts of stuff. In a lot of cases, they have money and incentives to restore habitat, and then they will often know of programs through other foundations like National Fish and Wildlife Foundation that will actually pay you money to keep some of those habitats in forest for whatever purpose that is. It might be for salamanders or carbon sequestration or anything of those, but those NRCS outreach agents are a great place to start.
Yes, and you got that right, JJ, EQIP, that acronym. Good job. All right, a couple other questions we have about 15 minutes left in today's panel. We did have somebody ask a question that's kind of specific, and I'm interested to hear if y'all have any opinions on it. And it's about hunting in an area, if it affects salamanders. And I'm assuming, because the follow-up is like, will the new bismuth non-lead shot affect the salamanders? And so my question is, does current lead shot and other things like that affect salamander populations? And again, it's kind of a small, like, niche question, so I understand if it's not answerable at this time.
I've never seen any literature on anything like that, but again, I think, when I think about these populations, we're talking about large populations across the landscape, and it's yeah, I don't think hunting is going to have a negative effect because of whatever's in the bullets.
Yeah, I can say that there's a little bit of work out there on lead toxicity in salamanders, and salamanders, it can be toxic to them, but they actually show a remarkable tolerance to it because they eat soil fauna. And so they've kind of evolved to eat things that are packed with dirt in their bellies. And so they get exposed to fairly decent doses of lead anyway. And compared to other vertebrates, they actually show a decent tolerance. I can't imagine that the amount of lead that is introduced into the environment through hunting would have enough of an impact to really register on these animals the way it has been suggested for some other larger birds and mammals in these kind of landscapes. So.
Unless you're a really bad shot.
Yeah, I'm still not convinced.
All right, thanks, folks. The next question that we have is talks about stream crossings. So many stream crossings for forestry are temporary. Rehab of many of these crossings have slash or tops, seed and straw on the approaches. Do you think these current erosion control practices isolate salamander populations? And other than not crossing the stream, what rehab efforts do you suggest?
This is definitely in Kristen's alley. I mean, it's like her wheelhouse.
Yeah, I just keep thinking like not crossing is the best. But I mean, I think choosing locations where you're going to minimize and choosing like approaches that you're going to minimize transport of sediment from the upland. So I think anytime that you can think about disconnecting what's happening above the stream to what's happening in the stream, whether that's a short-term or long-term kind of thing, is what you want to do. I think, putting down hay and seed and things like that, it's going to be a short-term effect. And then you're just going to go back to sort of having these new erosion pathways that are going to accelerate the travel of sediment and water and things like that into the stream. So I think kind of any way that you can reduce the sort of gradient of that road coming into the stream, if you can reduce those kinds of pathways and erosion, I think you're going to be better suited. So it may take some site scouting and things like that to look for, elevation change and things like that, that's going to minimize those impacts. There was a follow-up just about planting trees. And I think some of that may help in the long term. But again, you're still going to have the short-term impact of near stream erosion.
Awesome, thank you. We did have another follow-up from someone asking about other ways to increase salamander populations where they don't currently exist.
Yeah, I saw a lot of that. Yeah, please avoid any kind of pet store or stocking or anything like that. I mean, I think it really is a build it and they will come sort of situation. It's just gonna, for some species, it's gonna take a lot of time, and it really depends on, what's in the surrounding habitat. And if you're in a really degraded area for miles and miles, it might never happen. But we've seen when we build wetlands, at least here in the Southern Apps, oftentimes we have 8 or 9 species in the first year documented. And so they will, eventually find it on the landscape. Again, obviously different species disperse in different ways. In the first year, it might be, newts and two-line salamanders or something similar. But yeah, eventually, if the habitat is right and the surrounding landscape is not terrible, then they'll eventually show up.
So we work a a fair bit on this. So we've been doing for over a decade now, developing approaches for doing both captive rearing and translocation of rare frogs, and now we're doing it with newts and some other species. So I think that there are opportunities to think about facilitating that process, but I would say that your number one principle is do no harm, right? So you do not want to move anything around that could potentially harm what is already there or bleed over into important areas. And so the most important way to do that is to engage with your state biologists, your local, with other entities, and not do this just kind of on your own. So as an example, in South Carolina and some parts of Georgia now, where Longleaf Alliance has been working with private landowners to restore longleaf pine ecosystems in those areas. A lot of these private landowners have some beautiful wetlands on those properties. And what they're wondering is, is this a wetland that could hold gopher frogs, or could it hold striped newts or flatwood salamanders or tiger salamanders or any of these things? And so what they've done is engage between Longleaf Alliance and biologists, first to have the property surveyed and to see what is there potentially, and what is the potential for it to be naturally recolonized by neighboring sites or those kind of things. And then if that probability is low, then those biologists do an assessment of whether or not the current wetland conditions and upland conditions could adequately support the species. And then they ask to be included as a potential site for translocations. But those translocations are authorized and coordinated by the state biologists in terms of where you're going to get the animals from. Do they go through any kind of screening or, process for making sure that we clear them of potential diseases before they're moved, or any of those kind of things. So it is possible to think about accelerating, or if you happen to be managing a property where the likelihood of, particularly in the coastal plain, where the likelihood of recolonization on its own can be really difficult because these populations are so isolated from each other in some of those areas. So I think if you feel like you have a property where this is something you would value and it's an objective that you have, to reach out to your local state biologist and some folks and see if you can engage with a program that might say, yes, we would be interested in, looking at your site as a place to translocate those animals. But I would discourage anyone from just kind of doing it on their own. If you want to do that. What we call assisted migration or assisted dispersal is something not to be taken lightly. We're playing God, as it were. Not that also cutting down forests and doing all the other things we do isn't some of that, but it's not something to be taken lightly. And the potential for inadvertent consequences, I think, is important. You also have to think, as JJ mentioned early on, you have to think about where that animal's coming from and the impact on the source population of where you get them. We don't want you pulling them out of the pet trade. So, in Georgia, for example, we have a number of facilities that now captive rear these animals, and the state gets to determine where those animals go, but they are being reared at specific facilities for the intention of reintroducing them to properties that have been restored. So it's a very conscientious and collaborative process that we engage in there. So that's the way I would encourage people to approach it.
All right, thanks all. So we've got 5 minutes left, and definitely way more than 5 minutes worth of questions in the chat box and from registration questions. So I might just choose one or two, probably maybe just one that have time to answer. And this one, okay, I'll start with this one. It might be shorter, and then the next one. So if deer are browsing the oak hickory understory extensively, does that affect salamander populations? And I think that question was kind of in response to when we were talking about fire and shrubby understory, and the fun fact that salamanders do in fact climb.
Kristen, do you want to take that on first, or?
Sure, I guess I can try. I'm just thinking, like, our forest right now, we're so heavily hit by deer that there's almost no structure left in our forest. It's almost entirely mature canopy trees, and we're doing a lot of things to try to change that, whether that's fire or mechanical removal. But I think it's going to have a negative effect, right? You're changing the structure of the forest. You're changing the microclimates that are on the forest floor. So you're going to shift activity. And, ultimately, if you're affecting surface activity, you're going to affect feeding rates, survival, reproduction, and things like that. So that's kind of a very general answer, but I'm trying to think if I've ever heard anybody sort of directly connect those to long-term persistence.
Yeah. There's a little bit of research out there, and I would say you need to take it with a big old whopping, like a couple tablespoons of sugar. So there are a few studies that people have done deer exclosures and then measured critters inside deer exclosures and what versus in the areas where deer have access. And what they have found is that I think in 2 or 3 of those studies, they have found that salamander abundance and diversity was, quote, higher where the deer could browse compared to the control areas. The problem with that is that in those control areas, they have lots of dense vegetation, and in none of those studies did they account for that. You just get harder to find salamanders in dense vegetation. So they don't really employ some of the best practices we have for estimating whether or not you really see an effect of deer. There are some folks at Cornell University that are currently doing a long-term experiment in Eastern New York on looking at deer in conjunction with other things like earthworm invasions and stuff like that on salamander communities and population abundances there. But their work has not, they don't have any results from that work yet that are available. So I would say that I don't know that we know what the effects of deer browse and stuff like that, is on salamander populations. So I would just be careful. I don't know that we know that it's positive, negative, or benign. And I'm kind of with Kristen. It's a little hard for me to see a very direct connection to them yet. But I'm open to being convinced that there might be.
Yeah, I agree. I've never really seen what I would call direct evidence of that. I haven't really thought too much about it. Of all the things that I think about that involve managing for salamanders and conserving salamanders, deer browse is never really been on the list. Of course, here in the mountains in North Carolina, we probably don't have the deer density that Kristen's talking about either. But yeah, I'd say probably agree that we really don't know, but probably not a big issue, at least in most areas.
Dakota, could I say, though, there is a person who asked about hogs. And I think hogs are a serious threat to salamanders, particularly stream breeding and wetland breeding species. We've done work in the coastal plain, as well as some people in Florida, and showed that, once abundant common salamanders, once hogs have come through a site, they're either dramatically reduced in abundance or sometimes extirpated from those areas. I would imagine that a lot of the stream salamanders, like Kristen studies in the mountains, would be equally vulnerable. There's some work I'm involved in at Savannah River site and in South Carolina and Georgia, and when about 16% of hog bellies have an amphibian in them, and when and so these guys are definitely rooting them up in the ground, and then of course the impact that they have on the soil and just drying it out and turning it over and breaking up all those burrows. So unlike deer, we know what hogs do, we can directly link to why that would be bad for salamanders. And the evidence suggests that they can be very destructive to salamander habitat. So hogs are, I think, a serious threat. And as they expand, particularly in Appalachia, where they've really dramatically increased over the last decade, we've seen some high elevation sites, terrestrial sites, where we come in and hogs have absolutely just decimated one of our study sites in, a couple of weeks. So they are a significant threat, I think, to salamander population.
Yeah, I totally agree. There was this another recent study in the Smokies in the national park that said the same thing. They eat salamanders. They just destroy little wet areas, little seeps, little wetlands, little boggy spots, just totally bulldoze up large moss mats, just wreak havoc on those habitats and the animals within. So yeah, hogs are bad, definitely.
So we need hog hunters. Hog hunters
Yep,
are,
it's open season in North Carolina, I believe, on hogs. But yeah, they're a growing problem here in the state for sure.
All right. Well, I think we're at 11:30. I think ending with that note, one of the best things you can do for salamander population is go hunt a hog. But I wanted to say thank you so much to our panelists and thank you all of our participants for asking such great questions. And I apologize that we didn't have the time to answer all of them. I am dropping into the chat box right now for those of you that want continuing education credits, a form to fill out. Awesome. Yep. And the link did hyperlink. So please fill it out in order to get those CFEs. And I also wanted to say thank you to Pactive Evergreen for making this presentation possible. And again, thanks to the panelists. And if anyone has any further questions, feel free to reach out to me and I'm sure we can connect you all. Yeah, thanks.